Okay, hi everybody. So now we're going to switch to, or now we're going to discuss the contradictions of capitalism. So, as with every other economic system, according to Marx, every system will fall, with the exception of socialism, which we'll talk about later. And the contradictions of capitalism are those tensions or those problems within the system that will ultimately lead capitalism to destroy itself. We are going to talk about 4 of those contradictions. There are others. This is a bit oversimplified. There's a little bit more going on here, but this is what we're really going to focus on. Really, what's at the heart of this whole process, though, is false consciousness. As we talked about in the lecture on false consciousness, the proletariat are blind to their oppression, and they're blind to the fact, from Marx's perspective, that capitalism harms them. In fact, the proletariat believe that capitalism helps them. Well, what the contradictions of capitalism are going to help do is help the proletariat wake up and essentially blow away that false consciousness so that the proletariat can become aware of their oppression and become aware of themselves as being all part of the same class. Once they do that, they will rise up and overthrow the capitalist system. And that will usher in socialism. We'll talk about what that will actually look like, what that overthrowing might actually look like in the lecture on socialism. So for right now, let's just jump right into the contradictions. So we're going to go through each capitalism one at a time. And the first is relatively simple, relatively straightforward, and focuses on the role of profit in capitalism. We're actually going to see profit come up quite a bit during this conversation on contradictions. And it's important to know what profit is. So if you look here, all profit is revenue minus cost. So if I own a business, I manufacture cars. It costs me a certain amount of money to manufacture a given car. Let's say it costs me, I'm making up numbers off the top of my head. It costs me $9,000 to produce a car. That's all the engineering, all the shipping, all the manufacturing, all the raw materials, all that stuff together. And I sell the car for $10,000. Well, $10,000 is my revenue, $9,000 is my cost, so my profit is $1,000. That's what I get as the owner of the business. Well, so my goal as a capitalist, as a member of the bourgeoisie, and I'm going to use those words really interchangeably, is to maximize profit. That's what companies do. There's no crazy Marxist conspiracy theory here. This isn't some left-wing crazy socialist idea. This is very typical, very common understanding of how businesses work. This is what businesses do. They try to generate profit. There's nothing controversial about that. And so if you're a business owner, you're trying to maximize profit, and so you want to reshape this calculation in the way to get this number as high as possible. So we have to think about the costs of production. Well, there are 4 main costs of production that we can think of. One is the wage bill. That's just how much you're paying your employees. There are the raw materials, so how much you're paying, for instance, if you're making cars, for steel, for rubber for the tires, for metal for the wiring, for glass, all that stuff. Maintenance of equipment, so you are using factory labor, so you have big machines and robots and things that are helping you or responsible for a good chunk of the actual production. So you need to maintain that. Equipment breaks down, you need to get it fixed. And finally, there's rent. That's just the cost of land and the physical space. So if you're renting the building rather than owning it, or you don't own the land, that's all a cost. So if you are trying to maximize your profit, one way to do that is to cut your costs. Anything you cut out of costs, you keep as profit. But there's the issue that we as buyers don't control the things that don't control the prices that we pay for things. So for instance, raw materials. If you're a bourgeoisie factory owner, you're a capitalist, you don't control what you pay for example, for steel or for glass or for any of those things. The cost of those commodities is determined, like every other commodity, by the amount of labor that has gone into producing those raw materials. So you can't just decide to pay less for instance, steel. You can't decide to pay less for the maintenance of your equipment. You can't decide to pay less for your building or for your factory. Of these costs, the only real control that the capitalist has is over the wage bill. How much he or she pays his workers. Now, the capitalist doesn't have the capacity to just cut any individual worker's wage. Can't just say, okay, I'm going to pay you less. What the capitalist can do a couple things. One, it can have the workers work longer hours, pay them the same amount of money. That doesn't reduce costs, but it does make them more productive. But what can actually reduce the cost of the wage bill is technological innovation. So if I am the business owner, if I can replace a good chunk or some portion of my workers with machines, then the amount of labor that's going into the production of the thing that I'm making goes down, which means that I now pay less. I don't have to pay as much in terms of wages. I've replaced human beings with machines. So that cuts down the number of workers that I have, so my wage bill goes down, my profit can go up. So the first contradiction we can think of in these terms. It is rational of the capitalist to seek to maximize profit and minimize costs. So it's rational. Capitalists want to minimize costs, they want to maximize profit. It is rational for the proletariat to maximize access to the means of life. As we talked about earlier in the exploitation lecture, the wage for the proletariat is access to the means of life. It allows the worker, to survive, to meet his or her needs. So both of these drives, the drive to maximize profit and minimize cost, and the drive to maximize access to the means of life, are independent of the personality of the individual. So it doesn't matter if you, as an individual capitalist, individual member of the bourgeoisie, hate that you have to maximize profit and minimize cost. You have to. You have no choice. If you don't, your business will fail. We'll talk about why that is later. But you don't have a choice. You have to try to maximize profit and minimize cost. If you remember the proletariat, you're going to try and maximize access to the means of life. So this is about individuals. Marx very rarely, if ever, talks about individuals. He talks about classes and groups, and that really comes out here. But the implication of this contradiction is pretty straightforward. It's not that complicated here. It's just that this tension between capitalists trying to minimize the wage and proles trying to maximize the wage creates a point of tension between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So, as we talked about in our discussion of false consciousness, capitalism depends on this ideology that sends the message that everybody has the opportunity to make it, and if you don't make it, that's your fault. Well, here we see that there are very separate interests that each group has. So capitalists have one interest, proletariat has another, and so that contradiction becomes a potential way for proles to wake up and realize, hey, wait, the system doesn't work for me. The bourgeoisie are actively trying to take away my access to the means of life, and that's going to help chip away at the false consciousness that the proles suffer from. The second contradiction of capitalism also is, at its heart, dealing with profit. And a fundamental feature, as we just talked about, of capitalism is that capitalists are always trying to maximize profits, and they're always looking for new ways to increase profit. They have to maximize profit in order to survive in business. If they don't, if you as a business owner don't increase profit, don't reinvest that profit back in your business, your competitors will, and they will outcompete you, and you will eventually go out of business, and ultimately then you end up getting kicked out of the bourgeoisie class, and you end up a member of the proletariat. As we talked before, one particularly effective way to increase profits is to replace workers with machines. Now there's something happens here that goes beyond, though, just creating this point of tension between the capitalists and the proles that we talked about with the first contradiction. Now, what's also going to happen is that over time, this drive to replace workers, this drive to innovate with technology to reduce the cost of production, is going to drive down profits for all producers in capitalism. For all members of the bourgeoisie, profits will go down. And as profits decrease, so too does the viability of any given market. If there are no profits to be had in a particular market, no businesses will operate in that market, and that market will collapse. Eventually, Marx argues that profits will decrease across capitalism, And that will cause massive problems for capitalism because capitalism can't exist without profit. The entire system is driven by the search for profits. So I'm going to give you an example. It's a little bit complicated. You'll probably have to look through it maybe once or twice, or more than once. But I'll do my best to explain, and you can feel free to ask me questions outside of this lecture if you need to. So let's imagine that you, me, all of us in the class, we all run Toyota. We're a car company, and specifically Toyota. And we're competing with two other car companies, GM and Honda. And we're trying to sell our cars in the American market. So again, our goal is to maximize our profit. So here's our starting situation. So we're going to take the market early on. We're going to imagine we're all making essentially the same car. It's not like I have higher or lower quality than anybody else. Nobody has higher or lower quality than we do. So we have essentially the same car that we're making and selling. So the price that we're charging for the cars is $10. It costs us $8 to produce the car. So we're all making $2 profit per car. So every car we sell, every car GM sells, and every car Honda sells nets those companies $2 in profits. So given this situation, though, how do we increase our profits? Because we are not satisfied with this situation, because you can never be satisfied. We always want more. We always want to increase our profit. So what can we do? I'm going to keep the original starting situation at the top of every slide, or most of the slides anyway, just to remind us of what we're starting with, so you don't have to keep it in your head. And then underneath, we'll talk about the kind of new situations as I introduce them. So if we want to raise our profits, well, why can't we just raise our prices? Well, if we raise our price to $12 per car, we're still only spending $8 to produce the car, it gives us a $4 profit. GM and Honda only have a $2 profit, so why can't we do that? Well, the reason why is because the second we raise our prices to $12 per car, no one is going to buy cars from us. So we might make more per car, but we're going to sell far, far fewer cars, if any cars. Because why would someone spend $12 when they can get the car for $10? So raising our prices is not going to increase our profits. It's actually going to hurt our profits. Well, why not do the opposite? Why not lower our prices? Why not sell our cars for less money than we did before? Again, up here hasn't changed. The starting situation is the same. Well, if we lower our prices, let's say we lower our prices lower our price per car from $10 to $9, yet now we're only making $1 profit per car, but who's going to buy cars from GM? Who's going to buy cars from Honda when they can buy them from us for less money? So we make less per car, but we sell more cars. But what's going to happen then? Well, didn't mean to go ahead to the next slide. What's going to happen immediately here is GM and Honda aren't going to have a choice. They're going to have to just immediately lower their prices so that they will then sell the cars for $9, and they're all going to make $1 profit. So when we at Toyota just lower our prices arbitrarily, all that does, it lowers our profits, and it also lowers GM and Honda's profits, so that's not good for anybody. So we can't do that. What we can do, though, instead, and this is what our real drive is going to be. So again, starting situation up here is exactly the same. But what we're going to do, we're going to try to do anyway, is trying to come up with some type of technological innovation that can reduce our costs. So instead of changing price, as we did in the previous examples, either increasing this number or decreasing it, what we want to do is we want to decrease this, the cost to produce. We want to decrease this from $8 down to something less than $8. So let's say we find a way to produce our cars for less money. What that is often going to mean is that we are going to come up with some kind of machine or way to organize our workforce or whatever that allows us to fire workers. So we replace a bunch of workers with some machines, and then that allows us to produce the cars for less money, for a lower cost. Now, when we do that, we're charging $9. Our cost to produce is $7.50. So here again, we see a situation where there's less profit per car, but we're going to sell more cars than either GM or Honda. Now, GM and Honda, if we look at this third table down at the bottom here, it's going to have a hard time matching us. Because, yeah, they can just reduce their prices, as we see it in this third table. They can absolutely just reduce their prices, but they're still losing to us. They're still not doing as well as we are. Yeah, their prices are matching ours, but they're making less profit than we are. So we're going to be the more profitable company. We're going to be able to outcompete them. That's important because the profit that we make can then be reinvested back in our business. We can innovate, and we can innovate more effectively than they can, and so on. So for at least a little while, we end up with a huge advantage. So again, because capitalism isn't just about maximizing profit, it's also about just beating your competitors. So that's a huge thing. You might be wondering why reduce our price to $9 instead of $9.50, so our profit is still the same. Yeah, that will happen. So it's very, very reasonable and very possible that instead of reducing our prices up here from $10 to $9, that we reduce our price from $10 to $9.50, so our profit would still be $2. But all that matters for Marx's argument is that there will be times when companies cut their prices to the point where they're actually making less profit per product sold in the short term, but they do that to make more money in the long term. So this will happen at some points where the profits of any individual company per product will go down. So I realize that may have been confusing. I hope it wasn't, but if it was, please just let me know, and I'll try to explain it more effectively, either face-to-face or by email. But what's going to eventually happen is, well, if we go back here, so yeah, we're going to be beating Honda and GM for a while, but eventually GM and Honda will catch up with us, unless they go out of business. They could just go out of business, which allows us as Toyota to do even better. We're going to see that in the fourth contradiction. But what's more likely is that GM and Honda will both figure out what I did, and they'll match it somehow so that they will also be able to reduce their cost to produce down to $7.50. And so in that instance, we are all now making $1.50 per car. So what ultimately happens is that over time, companies are driving forward, trying to come up with innovations that in the short term, drive our profits up. But in the long term, over time, profits will go down. So we start here, we end here, but then this cycle continues. So somebody else innovates, profits go down a little bit. In the short term, that company that innovates makes more money, makes more profit in the short term, but eventually the other companies catch up, and then profits are lower than they were at the starting point. So that's going to happen over time. Again, this is a serious problem because capitalism relies on profit. Marx calls this process, and so this is the second contradiction, the law of the tendency of the following, the law of the tendency of the falling rate of profit. So this process of innovation continues as long as capitalism exists. Now, eventually, though, profits get so low that the particular industry can't function. Why would anybody open a factory in a market if they can't profit from it? Again, capitalists are trying to make money. They're trying to profit. If you can't do that, why produce cars, for instance, if there's no profit there? Over time, it's not just particular industries that are going to have problems. It's the entire system, because industries throughout the economic system, industries throughout capitalism, will be facing the same issue of falling profits. So that's the second contradiction. The third contradiction of capitalism gets a bit more complicated. And the third contradiction of capitalism is rooted in what is a very strange, very unusual problem that capitalism has. And in fact, Marx points out that this particular problem would not be a problem in any other economic system. In fact, this problem, and it's got quotes around it, the word problem has quotes around it for a reason, this problem would be a cause for celebration in any type of society. Only in capitalism is this a problem. And the problem is that capitalism can produce more stuff than people can consume. Now, the caveat here is that capitalism can produce more than people can buy. So we're talking about producing more in terms of exchange value, not in terms of use value. But still, this is a bizarre problem. And this is a situation that we see pretty frequently. So, give you an example, when I was in high school, I used to work at the Square One Mall in Saugus. Not the greatest place on the planet, especially now. It's kind of garbagey at this point. But I had friends who worked at Au Bon Pain, or however the hell you say the name of that restaurant. I've never been able to figure it out. But they worked at Au Bon Pain. Obviously, I call it say Au Bon Pain just for simplicity. So they worked there, and I would sometimes, just meet up with friends after work when they were closing. Sometimes just to get a garage, sometimes just to hang out afterwards. And at the end of every shift, they would have 2 or 3 giant trash bags full of food that they were throwing away. Now, that was all just waste. It was pure waste. Now, there are plenty of people out there who could have used that food. Either people who are homeless or just who are food insecure. They don't have enough to feed themselves. Families with kids who can't feed those kids. Whatever. Plenty of people could have used that food. But they can't. Those people can't buy that food, so the food goes in the trash. Well, then why doesn't Au Bon Pain and every other restaurant out there, because they're all throwing away massive amounts of food, why don't they just give that food away to people who need it? It's not because people are going to sue if the food's bad. That might be a possibility or a fear, but that's not really the real reason. Even if you took that food away, these companies still wouldn't, or aren't very likely anyway, to give this food away. Well, the real reason is because if everyone knew that at the end of every shift, all the food at Au Bon Pain or any other restaurant gets tossed, it just gets thrown away, and Au Bon Pain or any other restaurant is willing to just give that food away, why would anybody ever buy the food in the first place? They wouldn't. So these companies have to hold back what they're producing. Even if they produce too much, even if it means wasting it all, they don't just give it away to people at the end. Okay, so we end up with too much stuff, and we end up with landfills, for instance, full of food, while there are plenty of starving people in the world. It's this weird issue with capitalism. In any other type of society, there's no agricultural society out there that has a massive harvest and is upset about it. They're excited. I mean, at worst, they don't eat the food, but at best, that food can sustain them through difficult seasons ahead. So it's a bizarre problem. And not only is capitalism producing more than it can consume, that's not just like a weird thing, but overproduction can actually be devastating to the system. It's not just that it's morally bad that we're throwing away food when people need it, but it's also dangerous to the system itself. So how does that actually happen? So I'm going to take you through an example of the process. So let's take the example of car markets, of car companies again. Now, what I'm about to describe is pretty similar to what happened actually after 9/11. So after September 11th, 2001, the economy went through a recession. And that was partly because of, I almost said driven by, making an accidental pun there, that process was, at the heart of that process, or one of the things that happened was car manufacturers overproduced cars, and they couldn't sell the cars. So why the hell is that a problem? Well, what happens here is car manufacturers overproduce cars. They have produced a ton of cars, people aren't buying them, so you end up with lots of unsold cars on dealer lots. The cars are just sitting there, they're not going away. Now, under those circumstances, profits are going to decrease. The companies, the car manufacturers, want to sell those cars. They really have to sell those cars. So what they're going to do is they have really to reduce the prices on those cars. They have to sell them for less than what they are worth in terms of their original exchange value. They have to sell them for less than the amount of labor that went into producing them. And when they do that, their profits go down, and so then those car manufacturers think to themselves, well, we are not going to need to make as many cars in the future, or at least in the short term. And there are a couple different consequences of that. The first of these consequences is that car companies buy fewer raw materials. So if you're General Motors or Toyota or Honda or any of these companies, and you now have decided that you are going to produce fewer cars, well, now you need less steel, you need less rubber, you need less glass, you need fewer engineers to design the cars, you need less of all these different things. Well, so what happens then to the industries that supply you with resources? So let's just think about steel companies. What happens is companies in these other industries can't sell what they produce. So what starts with an issue of overproduction in car markets ends up becoming an issue of overproduction in every industry that's associated with car manufacturing. So companies that make steel, or that mine steel, or that produce products made out of rubber, or that produce windshields, or companies that produce tires, all of a sudden those companies have now overproduced and they can't sell their products. So their profits decrease, and what happens ultimately then is that the cycle worsens and it spreads and the crisis continues. So now it's not just car companies, it's all the companies connected to car companies, and then it's all of the companies connected to car companies, and so on until the crisis, until this problem with decreased profits spreads throughout the entire economy. Now, at the same time as car companies and then other companies are buying fewer materials, they are also firing workers. So, not only are the car manufacturers purchasing less steel and rubber and so on, because they're producing fewer cars, they also don't need as many workers, because why do they need workers? They're not making as many cars, they can fire people. So those workers who get laid off, what happens to them? Well, they become unemployed, and unemployed workers spend less money in general. So what are they not doing? Well, one, they're not buying cars. So the people who used to work for car companies now are no longer customers for those car companies, so the car industry, or the auto industry also gets worse. But not only are they not spending money on cars, they're also not doing things like going out to eat. They're not going to the movies. They're not going on vacation. They're not buying DVDs. They're not buying computers. They're not buying anything. So all those industries that rely on consumers buying things, tourism, restaurant, consumer electronics, all of these different industries now are making less money. So now all of those industries have overproduced, and so on. Now, also I want to make one more connection here too. So these other companies, so let's say the steel manufacturers, not only are they not selling as much steel and so on, as the crisis spreads throughout the economy from industry to industry, all those industries are laying off workers. So it's not just car companies laying off workers, it's then the steel manufacturers, and then it's the shipping industry. So there's less need for truckers, and because there are fewer people going on vacation, the tourism industry is laying people off. There's fewer need for restaurant workers, and the movie industry suffers, so there are fewer movies being made. And this entire cycle just continues, and the crisis worsens and worsens and worsens and worsens. Now, eventually, though, this cycle will end. Prices will drop to the point where those who are still working will start to buy again, and the economy will begin to grow. Now, it's not just I want to point out, it's not just the people who are unemployed, for instance, or are losing their jobs, who are going to cut their expenses. It's also anybody who's nervous about losing their job. So there's this thing where even if your job is relatively secure, you start to see friends, family, whatever, lose their jobs. Well, you're probably less likely to do things like go out to eat and all that, because you're worried you're going to lose your job. You also don't want to, kind of stand out among everybody else. But if you are in a position where you are fairly secure, then you're actually in pretty good shape during one of these crises, because prices go way down. Again, after September 11th, the deals on cars were crazy. There was at one point where I heard a news report where car companies at one point got to where they were selling cars at a $400 loss. So every time someone bought a car, on average, that car company lost $400. So cars were dirt cheap. I remember buying a computer around that time. The computer was dirt cheap. Lots of things were really, really inexpensive. So eventually the prices get so low that people start to buy again. And then once people start to buy again, then those companies, car manufacturers, restaurant owners, whoever, start to produce more, they start to hire more workers, and then the system recovers. Now, this is another one of those ideas that isn't just a Marxian idea. if you've taken any business classes or any economics classes, what Marx is describing here is the business cycle. So about every 10 or 15 years, we have these cycles where we have growth in the economy, and then we have some kind of recession or depression. So the economy grows and expands, and then it contracts, it shrinks. Then it recovers, grows for a while, shrinks for a while. Now the general hope is, and the economy is healthy if, in general, the growth outweighs the losses. And that's typically what has happened in capitalist societies since the beginning of capitalism. But Marx is going to argue here that this cycle of boom and bust, of growth and then recession or depression, is going to get more volatile. So it's going to get more extreme. So the growth is going to get more extreme. The recessions are going to get more extreme, and they're going to get more destructive. So as growth happens, it's going to be really big and really fast. We're going to make a lot of money, a lot of profits. But then the recession or depression is going to hit, and companies are going to be devastated. The employees are going to get laid off in huge numbers. And then, again, there's going to be economic growth, but it's just going to swing back and forth in these much more violent ways. Now, the consequences of this process, the consequence of overproduction, which is this third contradiction of capitalism, is that, one, it fosters awareness among the proletariat. So, yeah, the bourgeoisie suffer during these types of crises. They lose money. The value of their investments go down. Their profits go down. Their stock portfolio decreases in value. But they are not suffering in the way that the proletariat is suffering. So, for instance, who's getting laid off? Well, for the most part, it's the members of the proletariat. When they get laid off, they have no income, so their access to the means of life cut off. They lose health care. They can't provide for their families. So it's not just them as individuals that are suffering. It's also their kids and their spouses and their broader families. And so they're suffering quite a bit more. And so Marx makes the case that the fact that the proletariat are bearing the brunt of these crises is going to help the proletariat wake up and say, hey, this type of system is really unstable. We are being devastated here, so we're not going to put up with it anymore. At the same time, it's going to make the proletariat not just question their place in the system, as they're the ones suffering in the system, while the bourgeoisie are relatively okay. There's also, this cycle also provides evidence of the instability of capitalism. This system that's supposed to provide for us and give us the best opportunity to make our way in the world is ultimately unstable, and so we can't depend on it. So again, that's another shot, another hit that false consciousness takes. So all these contradictions, according to Marx anyway, will ultimately help the proletariat move beyond that false consciousness. That it will help blow away that false consciousness, so they can become aware of how the system doesn't work for them, and that's happening in this cycle of overproduction. So that's the third contradiction. Our final contradiction of capitalism is, well, according to Marx anyway, and this one seems to actually bear out pretty well in the real world. Marx makes the case that wealth will eventually or gradually be concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Now, in other words, what that means is the bourgeoisie is going to grow consistently smaller as the proletariat grows larger. But as the bourgeoisie grows smaller, those who remain in the bourgeoisie will grow wealthier and wealthier. So more and more of the wealth, more and more of the means of production that the bourgeoisie holds will gradually become concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. So let's take a look at how this process can play out. So I realize this might not be the most intuitive way of thinking about this particular issue, but I want you to take a look at this screen and take a look at each one of these white boxes. And I want you to imagine each one of these white boxes is a company in a market. Let's imagine each one of these boxes is a company that makes and sells shirts. They're all shirt companies. So in an ideal capitalist market, this is what you would see. It would be something along these lines. You'd have a lot of relatively small companies that would be competing with one another to sell shirts. Now, in a situation like this, we want to think, well, what would life be like for workers? Well, imagine you're a worker at one of these companies, and the working conditions are terrible. Your boss is a jerk, it's unsafe, the hours are terrible, and it's just really horrible. Well, you have a lot of opportunities in this situation to go work somewhere else. So the competition that exists in markets isn't just for customers, it's also for workers. So if I'm a business owner, I really can't abuse or mistreat my workers past a certain point because they'll leave, they'll go work somewhere else, and they have a lot of opportunities to work somewhere else. So early market, and if you take an economics class, when they talk about markets, they're thinking about something like this, where there's lots of firms competing with each other. So yeah, that's their sense of of how markets are going to typically operate. And that's a relatively good situation for workers. It's not great. They're still exploited, still alienated, but they're not going to be as alienated, they're not going to be as exploited as they would otherwise be. So now, may not have looked like the slide changed there, but it did, because now on the bottom you can see that the question is, what would life be like for consumers? Well, in this situation, life for consumers would be relatively okay. Let's say you need a shirt, and you go to one company and they're selling shirts for a higher price than you are willing to pay. Well, you've got a ton of other places to go. So there's lots of opportunity to buy shirts or gain access to goods from lots of different places. Now that's going to keep a handle on business owners. So again, we want to think about business owners here. In a situation like this, no one business owner is in a position to really affect the market. If I'm a business owner and I just raise my prices, well, no one's going to buy anything from me because they have all these other people to buy from. If I'm making a bad product, no one's going to buy from me. So it keeps me honest. It keeps me from trying to screw over customers, screw over my employees, and so on. It also prevents any individual business owner, any individual member of the bourgeoisie, from getting massively wealthy. If I own one of these factories and I just suck out all the profit from my own use, well, my business is going to fail really, really quickly because these other business owners, let's say I'm over here and I'm just drawing wealth and money and money and money out of my business. Well, all these other people, they're reinvesting their profits back into their businesses, which means their businesses are getting better and mine isn't. So I'm eventually going to fail. So I can't get really all that much. I can't get a lot of wealth. The difference in wealth between a business owner and his or her employees is not going to be huge. So this is an early kind of ideal market. But the market's not going to stay like this for very long because we talked about that boom and bust cycle in during the third contradiction. Well, let's imagine there's a crisis. But what happens during the crisis is that people start buying less of everything, so people are going to buy fewer shirts. So let's imagine these 6 companies, the ones with X's on them, ultimately end up going out of business. They don't survive the crisis. Well, eventually the economy recovers. And so what happens? Well, the ones that have gone out of business, they're gone. But when the system recovers, consumers, people who want shirts, are going to want shirts again. And so the demand for shirts is probably going to go back to the level that it was before the crisis. In fact, it's probably going to be higher because people haven't bought shirts in a while. So there's going to be a lot of pent-up demand for shirts. So when people go out and they start buying shirts again, well, now there's fewer companies selling shirts. What that means is that those companies will now sell more shirts each. So each company that's left is going to be better off than they were before the crash, before the crisis. So that creates opportunities for some of the companies to grow and get larger. Now, there's still not that many of them. Still not many of these big companies, only 2 in this example. Still a lot of smaller companies. So even though these other companies are still bigger than the others, they still don't have a lot of control over the market. They still can't just arbitrarily raise their prices, for instance. They can't just start arbitrarily treating their workers badly. So the market is still relatively functional. But there's going to be another crisis. Another crisis comes along. Well, in this situation, which firms are in the best position to survive? Well, the bigger ones. Bigger companies have more reserves of money. They have more capacity. They just have, they're better able to survive crises. They're better able to survive situations where profits go down. So these bigger companies are quite a bit less likely to go out of business than some of these smaller companies are. So let's imagine another crisis hits. These 10 companies go out of business. What happens when there's a recovery? Well, now we have more of these kind of medium-sized firms, and now we see this other larger firm. At the same time, it's not just crises that are driving this process. As individual firms get larger and larger, they can start to acquire smaller firms. And then smaller firms can merge in order to compete with larger firms. So let's say, you're this group up here, you're a bunch of small firms, you think, oh wow, these big firms over here seem to be doing better than we are. They're surviving, or they're having a better time during crises. They're more efficient. Maybe they can produce more than we can. Why don't we merge? These bigger companies might start acquiring or purchasing smaller companies. Let's imagine this company right here purchases this company. These four all merge together. This company buys out these smaller companies. And over time, we can see that the number of bigger companies grows, smaller companies shrink. So eventually, this is going to be something like this. Now, I know this is really abstract, and it might seem really extreme the way I'm presenting this. So, we start with, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 36 firms down to 5, and they're all now these huge firms. But that's actually not ridiculous at all. We can see in the real world this kind of thing happening. What's in front of you right now is a chart that I pulled off the internet. It's from motherjones.com. You can see the link at the bottom. And this is a chart looking at the banks in the United States from starting in 1990 all the way up to 2009. And so this is from 7 years ago. So this is probably different now. Actually, I'm pretty sure it is different now. So here we start with many, many, many major banks, but they eventually acquire one another or merge until we end up with 4 large banks. Again, this is 2009, so things have happened. More has happened since then. So take, for instance, Bank of America. So you could have gotten hired at Continental Bank. Let's say you, in 1990, get hired at Continental Bank. Well, you get bought out by Bank of America. You become part of Bank of America. Or here, actually, let me give you a better example. So you get hired at UJB Financial down here. Summit Bank Corp buys your company. You are now an employee of Summit Bank Corp. Then Fleet Boston Financial buys Summit Bank Corp. You, without having switched jobs, without having applied for a new job, you end up working at Fleet Boston Financial, which ultimately then gets bought up by Bank of America. So where you start one place, you ultimately end up at another. And if you have a bank account at UJB Financial, eventually you end up with a bank account at Summit Bank Corp, and then Fleet Boston, and then Bank of America. So we see all of these different companies becoming one over 20 years. That's not a lot of time. So this kind of thing happens in the real world quite a bit. Here's another example. It's the media and the media industry. Years and years ago, you go back to the 40s, 50s, we had many, many, many media companies, but they have consolidated to the point where now we have about 6 major media companies. So this process is very real. So what are the consequences of this concentration? Well, when we think about the original market, that small market at the very, very beginning, we can think about how, business owners in that situation, for instance, can't take advantage of their workers and they can't control the market. So if I am one of many, many shirt manufacturers or one of many, many banks, I have to treat my employees relatively well, because if I don't, I'm going to lose my employees. I have to treat my customers relatively well. I have to charge them fair prices. I have to provide them with decent service. If I don't, I'm going to lose those customers. Well, over time, what's going to happen? As we have fewer and fewer companies, those companies become more and more powerful. They have more control over their consumers. They have more control over their employees. And their large amount of power also gives them influence over the government and over the writing of laws. If I'm one of 36 or 100 or 1,000 small companies, I can't get senators and congressmen of the House of Representatives to write laws that benefit me personally or my company personally. or my industry. But if I'm one of a few mega wealthy business owners, I can do that, and that kind of thing happens quite frequently, and there's no controversy there. That kind of thing happens all the time. Now, what's going to happen for the system? Well, for Marx, this increasing concentration of wealth is going to happen. It is a natural consequence of just the process of capitalist competition. But it is dangerous to capitalism and will ultimately cause huge amounts of problems because during early capitalism, it's really easy for the proletariat to maintain their false consciousness. It's really easy to see themselves as benefiting from the system because if your boss doesn't make that much more money than you, your boss doesn't really have a lot of control over what you do. You have a lot of other opportunities to go work other places. You have a lot of opportunities to buy your products at different kinds of places. You are not going to be suspicious of the system. You also, when there are lots of small companies, you are in a position where it's not ridiculous for you to be able to start your own factory someday. It's not incredibly likely, but it could happen. Compare that to now, where, for instance, let's say you wanted to start a retail store. Well, how are you going to start a retail store when you have to compete against Walmart or Target? You can't. So opportunities are closed off to you. So opportunities to work in other types of other firms or organizations because there are enough fewer places to work. Opportunities to start your own business and move out of the proletariat yourself. And you also there's another major problem here is that you can see the end result of this kind of concentration when you watch the news or you watch entertainment shows or whatever, and you hear stories about these mega wealthy people. It's really easy to see capitalism as a fair system when the richest person in your community is still pretty close to you in terms of wealth. But when you have people like Bill Gates, who's got, 30-something billion dollars, you've got the Waltons, I think, who own Walmart, who are massively wealthy. You have them living these amazing over-the-top lifestyles where they have private jets and private submarines and massive yachts and a staff in their home of many, many servants and others. It's really, really hard for people in the proletariat to accept that the system is doing anything other than serving just the bourgeoisie. So again, we see another shot, another attack on false consciousness. So within that context, socialism can emerge, and it will emerge, according to Marx, very naturally. Because the proletariat will eventually become aware of their oppression and of their status as a class. Once those differences between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie become really, really stark, become really, really clear, the proletariat will realize the system doesn't work for them. They can't work hard and make it. They can't do anything about the fact that the bourgeoisie are harming them, are keeping them down. At least they can't do anything about it within the context of capitalism. So together, the proletariat will realize their status as a class. Things like racial divides, things like ethnic divides, things like religious conflict, things like the conflict between the sexes, all that stuff will fade away. Everyone in the proletariat will come together and they'll rise up and they will destroy the capitalist system and they will destroy the bourgeoisie. Now, Marx does not predict, he doesn't say how that revolution is going to happen. In fact, it could happen in different ways in different countries. It's not going to look the same everywhere throughout the world, just like the transition from feudalism to capitalism didn't look the same everywhere in the world. In some places, this revolution might be bloody. The proletariat might rise up and literally just kill everyone in the bourgeoisie. In other situations, it might be completely peaceful, where the folks in the proletariat will just no longer recognize that the bourgeoisie are in charge. Now, you might be wondering, well, won't the law stop the proletariat from rising up? Won't the police, won't the military stop the proletariat from rising up? Well, no, they won't, because or at least they're unlikely to. If they do, it still won't stop the revolution. according to Marx. A couple things. Well, one, who makes up the military? Who makes up the police? Well, members of the proletariat. It's not rich capitalists who are walking the streets arresting drug dealers. It's members of the proletariat. Well, what about the law? Won't people respect the law, and won't people not want to rise up and destroy and steal from the capitalists? Well, the thing is, for Marx, the law and the government are what Marx calls the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. The executive committee of the bourgeoisie. So the proletariat will realize that, and will realize that the legal system, the law, property rights, all those different things, just serve capitalism. Those laws and that legal system is part of the system that is oppressing the proletariat, and so the proletariat will not respect those laws and will move forward and destroy the system, and that will usher in socialism, which we will talk about either next lecture or the one after it.